This week on Life and Faith.
How can this intersection of the work that I do and the work that my family does come to life? That was a 10-year journey.
I think it's around 18 wars and sadly 3 genocides over 35 years.
Not only are there differences, but there are multiple differences.
Women can be gentle, but at the same time they are very strong.
Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart.
I'm Max Jagannathan.
Good to be with you, Max. Now, the idea of socially responsible or ethical investing is not a new one. It can be dated back to align with some of the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. And a couple of examples include the Quakers, who had as a central part of their thinking responsible behaviour in the marketplace. And John Wesley, who was an early Christian thinker and leader, was also big on developing a really clear understanding of the ethical use of money. He used to say, make as much as you can and then give it all away. And as the influence of markets and capital has grown, ethical investing, while still championed by many people of faith and faith-based organisations, has spread, hasn't it, Max, to every corner of society.
That's right, and it's really taken off in a more explicit and intentional way since the end of the Cold War. And that makes sense when we think about it, given that our global financial and economic system is now pretty broadly based on the idea of the free movement of money and assets and wealth and capital. The need for ethics in the mix has become more and more important. Of course, there are always debates around about how to reform or remake or even revolutionise the system. And there are always some pockets of thinking that would love to see the end of capitalism entirely. But for better or worse, capitalism runs the table in the 21st century. And so ethical investing and impact investing play an interesting role in trying to make capitalism more compassionate and more beneficial for real people.
Yeah, it's interesting, Max, that when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, this important book that had such an enormous influence in laying down the principles of supply and demand and the idea of free markets, he also wrote another book. It's much shorter and much less well known, called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And in that, Smith makes the point that this idea of capitalism is all well and good for generating wealth, but if it's going to work for real people, it's going to need an ethical framework. It's going to need people to think beyond the profits.
Yeah, you're right, Simon. And I think that need for a moral dimension in how we make money, how we grow our money, and how we use money is increasingly recognised, by some at least, as being incredibly important. On any measure, capitalism has had enormous benefits, pulling hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and improving our quality of life. But there's also been pretty clear and undeniable drawbacks, downsides, or at least risks. Building a world with profits and profitability as our ultimate objective always runs the risk that people can get left behind, that people can get hurt, and that we can damage our environment and each other along the way. Of course, there are always critics out there that think that the idea of bringing ethics and social responsibility to capitalism is just virtue signalling.
Yeah, it can be that too, can't it, Max?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's always a risk of that, and there are always elements of that at play. But whatever one might think of it, it's people having a crack at doing good. And surely that's worth thinking a bit more carefully about. It's also interesting, though not really surprising, that the World Economic Forum's recent report on religion and spirituality recognises that faith-based investors were the front-runners in socially responsible investing long before it became commonplace.
Yeah, I think that's right, Max. And as some of our listeners will remember, we did a podcast episode on ethical eating that featured my local butcher.
That's right.
His name's Tom.
Yep.
That just gave us a glimpse of what ethics and social responsibility in the marketplace can look like in a small business context, thinking more carefully about materials they use, the use of plastics, the sourcing of their meat and their products, and that kind of thing. Now, that episode gave us an example of how this kind of thinking can play out at the grassroots level. But today we want to take a look at some of the higher level thinking and motivations of social impact and ethical investing. And so, Max, we are turning to a conversation you had with Sam Richards, who is the Managing Director of Brightlight, which is a socially responsible impact investment firm. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's right, Simon. Brightlight seeks to work with their clients and use financial markets in ways that do a few things. It They seek to discourage harm in society, and they also seek to do good for society. Whether it's investing in local initiatives to improve employment prospects, education outcomes, water quality, sanitation, or just to empower those who are marginalised and downtrodden, things like that. I began by asking Sam to outline in his own words how he sees the world of ethical and socially responsible investing.
At the very heartbeat of this is about connecting some part of investors' values with this exercise of making money through financial markets, through investing into private markets, and private markets being things that aren't on stock exchanges. And so if you look at the broad proliferation of this, there's so much language out there. Environmental social governance, ESG, which are the factors that people think about when they're valuing a company, or managing risk in the future about how a company might behave from an environmental or social or even from a governance perspective, all the way through to impact investing or social impact investing, as it's sometimes termed. And so what we, Brightlight, try to do is help investors to think through this connection between their portfolios and ultimately what they're purposed to do. So their core personal values, their core corporate values, and how that's expressed into the way that they engage with listed markets, so stocks, bonds.
Right.
What things should they exclude from their portfolio, and the things that they may want to intentionally invest into to express those values. And then this idea that you can do more than just kind of avoid harm or potentially even benefit society, but you may want to contribute to the solutions that are going to change our world, right? And we think about impact investing as the part that makes a contribution to the way that capital can help resolve some of the big problems that our society and our planet is dealing with.
Thank you for that. I mean, that sets out in a principled way a really nice foundational framework. I guess on top of that, the next layer up then, what's an example that you're able to share with us of a successful values-based social impact investment that you've been involved in and that you're proud of? I know you've got probably plenty up your sleeve, but why don't you give us an example of one?
Yeah, so our business is structured to give advice to investors and to create solutions to social and environmental problems. And so this is kind of us helping investors change their mindsets. And you could echo this and say us changing heart sets as well. So that might be everything from helping a community foundation in Australia align its portfolio to the kind of impact that its community of givers want to have in the world.
Right.
All the way through to a foundation in Japan developing a specific sleeve of its portfolio contributing to gender lens investing. So this idea that it may want to deploy capital into women-led enterprises, enabling infrastructure, things that are transformative for women entrepreneurs as they seek out capital to scale the enterprises that they're building. And so we get excited about that part where we can change mindsets, change heart sets, and help to bring alignment between investor and portfolio. But we also get excited about generating solutions to big problems in our country. And so we might think about in Australia working with First Nations groups and working very specifically with an organisation called First Australians Capital to help them develop out a Indigenous-led, Indigenous-owned fund manager. And so this whole idea that you can be catalytic through the work of others is another thing that really inspires us as a business. So working to help FAC, as they're kind of known, to turn themselves into an institutional platform that is helping to stimulate and scale the Indigenous economy and not imposing ourselves on that, but allowing them to flourish as an organisation in their own right. Those couple of different emphases inside of our business is something that really drives our mission.
Yeah, right. Amazing. So really what you're talking about is kind of making sure that ground level, grassroots organisations, businesses, community-minded enterprises get the benefit of private markets, if you like, get the benefit of this old idea of capitalism.
Get the capital to where it's going to be transformative.
Right.
And some of that is about changing the mindsets of large institutions, large asset owners, some of them are families, some of them are foundations, and being able to help those entities really live out their own mission and purpose, all the way through to the intermediaries and the entrepreneurs who are doing transformative work in the world and making sure that they get the capital to further that work.
Now, I mean, all of that sounds really obviously quite promising and even, dare I say, even idealistic and ideal in a sense. And I'm sure in the midst of all of that, you've come across an understanding out there, perhaps a misunderstanding, that this world that you're talking about of investments and capital growth and private markets, It all calls for an element of ruthlessness and kind of profit-centric thinking that might not be compatible naturally with things like values and social improvement. How would you respond to that?
That is a tension. That is a tension. And folks often come to us with this idea that isn't capital markets about being mercenary. I always kind of peel it back to the origins of what stock exchanges, what capital in a private setting was intended to do. And that was really about being a utility to serving the furtherance of the community itself. And so this idea that, yes, generating a profit is about being sustainable and purposeful in the long term, but alignment of business models driving that profit, but also driving the outcomes from an impact perspective, from a community service perspective, from an environmental perspective. Some part of what all capital markets should do. And so this is the threatening rebuttal to that comment, Max.
Yeah.
We sit here and we go, oh, we've got to do responsible investing and we've got to do impact investing. I guess our long-term, long-range vision would be for all investing to be positive, responsible, impactful. And so what we're trying to do is show how ultimately capital and businesses need to align to some of the social and environmental outcomes that right now feels like it's an aspirational subgroup, but long-term should be what markets is about. And so it's almost this concept of reclaiming the territory, if you will.
Right. And that's territory that, in your view, in a historical sense, is why it all came to be in the first place. This idea that, the markets were made for people. It's not that people were made for the markets. Is that right?
So this is not about taking rent, right?
Right.
If you look at the way that capital markets have been structured over the last little while, there's a lot of rent-taking activity that's going on, right? Either through intermediation or through the way that corporates have structured themselves, through some of the industry that we talk about being less about community and much more about profitability, and the incentive structures that have been put in place implicitly driving that behavior. What we're asking is, let's go back to the root here and see how capital might serve the purposes of people and planet from a stewardship lens.
Right.
And taking a holistic approach to not just kind of ownership, but actually alignment. And I think for us, that's about reclaiming the purposes of markets. And, for us and our peers, we see this distinction between kind of the distances of Wall Street and the impact that we're trying to have through some of the social enterprises and community-based organizations we often find ourselves partnering with. But doing that in a way that brings sustainability and profitability to bear in a way that maybe philanthropy can't do.
That's fascinating. As you know, this podcast is titled Life and Faith. And just on that faith side of things, there's a parable that comes to mind from the Bible, when Jesus speaks to three servants. They're all given money by their boss. Two of them invested successfully. One just buries it and hands it back. And the boss condemns the one who didn't achieve any capital growth, didn't take any risks. This has always fascinated me because, in the Bible, there's a lot of scripture that warns against the love of money and the risks associated with becoming money-minded and profit-centric. But I'm interested in your thoughts on this and whether you think, a parable like that has any overlap in your world of values-based investing and in the work of Brightlight in the context of faith and values. How do they come into it, if at all?
I love the parable to begin with. I think it's a really underpinning reference point for the work that we do. I think this idea that stewardship, to reintroduce that word. And, for people of faith, this is a recognition that we are holders of assets on behalf of a greater God, right? For those that don't have a faith viewpoint on this, it might be a concept of holding assets with a greater sense of collective ownership.
Right.
We find this beautiful intersection between faith and unfaith communities in working towards the greater good, I suppose. And this parable for me represents this idea that we really should be trying to break down the bifurcation of these things. That if you are a person of Christian faith, you should be seeing the assets as something that is entirely of God. So not just taking the 10%, if you will, and giving either as an expression of philanthropy or tithing or words that are consistent with this almost separation of giving and creation of wealth. For us, it's this concept of let's go back to the stewardship. Let's ask, are we the owners or just the holders?
Right.
And if we're just the holders, how do we amplify the purposes of the resources that have been given to us? And how do we help that be purposeful, not just in the accumulation of wealth? We think that's part of it, And so achieving a financial return that's commensurate with the risk that these investments represent, but selecting investments that align to the greater concept of transformative and purposeful change that we hope to see in the world. And so no longer thinking of this as a 10% or a marginal element of our accumulation being given away, but a kind of concept of the whole and its purpose being reclaimed.
Right. So it's very much an idea that, faith and values are not a bolt-on to capitalism and making money, but they're to be integrated with it.
It's not just permitted, it's encouraged. The proverb that you think about here represents the encouragement to do more. And we see this with
institutions domestically in the region, globally, where there's choices to be made around even the preservation of capital. Is that some part of what we're meant to be doing? Just sticking it in term deposits of bank accounts?
Or are we asking the question around the role of risk
and alignment with the outcome and impact that we hope to have, either individually or as collectively in organizations, in a different way? And so, again, coming back to this question of, does the parable underwrite some deeper truth of how we think about this stuff? Absolutely it does. And it deeply connects with the activation that we're hoping to see.
Now, obviously, you're probably not able to name specific companies, but what are some examples of the actual sectors that this kind of action is happening in? Are we talking about manufacturing? Are we talking about fashion? Are we talking about services? Or is it just there's opportunities everywhere?
We see opportunities broadly.
Okay.
I think there's a simple truth to say we use a framework called ABC, which is avoid, benefit, contribute. And you can see the opportunity to invest with your values across all parts of your portfolio. So everything from listed equities to your fixed income,
all the way through to what has typically been the domain of
private assets. So your real estate, your private equity, your infrastructure. But the way that expression is given shape might look different. So you might look at your listed portfolios and decide you want to exclude things
in line with your values.
You might pick on things like tobacco, gambling. You might look at those sorts of sectors and say this, either from a values perspective or let's introduce another word, conscience perspective,
doesn't sit well with who I am. So I'm going to exclude them.
Right.
And then you might look at
parts of your public portfolio and ask, where can I put emphasis? And you might say, for me, the stewardship of our planet and the insurance of its longevity and its health and well-being, in a sense, is important. I'm going to invest into things that are looking to resolve some of the issues that our world is going through. And so you might allocate renewable energy, for example. Right. But we then think about private markets as where I love the word, where's the action happening?
Yes.
Right? Well, for us, when it gets to private assets, that's where you're seeing the greatest leverage on change, because you can get really close, so you can go into affordable housing and you can
do things in that space that maybe you can't do in listed markets.
You can work it with social enterprises in a really hands-on, tangible kind of way, if you choose to.
Right. And private assets, when you say private assets, you're basically talking about assets outside of the stock market, things that are not publicly listed.
So they tend to be privately held. They could be things like community infrastructure. You could be talking about health centres. You could be talking about Indigenous-owned enterprises. You could be talking about affordable housing or disability accommodation.
Right.
There's just a plethora of opportunities in that space
to allocate in a way that can be quite transformative.
And is it fair to say that the reason for that, or at least one of the reasons for that, is because once you're free of that publicly listed ecosystem, not that there's nothing happening there, but there's just a lot more agility and responsiveness and capacity for real people to do real things for other real people in communities. Is that oversimplification?
Yeah, you're trying to generate solutions to the problems of the world, right?
Right.
And whether it's venture capital or real asset or real estate type solutions, there is truth, even before you get to the alignment of values, that some of the greatest innovation happens in these spaces. This is the incubation of new ideas in many ways. It's the incubation of transformative ideas. We see ourselves as, in a sense, river guides for investors who are looking to shift more in that direction.
Life of Faith, and Max is speaking with Sam Richards, the Managing Director of Brightlight, which is a socially responsible impact investment company. And at this point in the conversation, Max asks Sam about the world of values-based impact investing and whether this is all about bringing together finance types with NGO types and how that plays out in the workplace. Here's Sam.
The power of bringing together institutional investing disciplines with what you could call institutional development disciplines.
Right.
So this idea that our team alone has people with not-for-profit backgrounds all the way through to ex-investment bankers and institutional investment managers. And so what we found is you need all of those elements to really do the work in this space, because you're trying to understand two drivers of value for an investor and frankly for the contribution we're making to society. What's the impact we're having? So how do we measure that, manage for it? How do we structure for it? And what are the fundamentals of these investments that we're making from a financial perspective as well? So when you work with these dual disciplines of financial outcome and impact outcome, if you will,
You've got to have a team that reflects that blend, right?
And so our composition of people, I think, and we use the word convergence a lot, Max,
aims to converge
the two types of outcomes that we're hoping our investment will bring.
Right.
And ultimately, when you get back to the way that this gets structured, there's role for different types of capital as well. There's a convergence there that's unfolding. So philanthropy still has a role to play because it can take risk that maybe investment capital can't. And so we're deeply committed to this idea that we live in a convergent world.
Yes.
In this space.
Yep.
And we think in a broader sense, our economy and our society is a convergent world. And there's too much sort of bifurcation of, hey, these are the financial people over here,
and these are the community workers over here. Actually,
bringing it closer together allows us to be far more innovative in the way we create products and solutions.
Right. And I think that's an important point to make too. So it's not that some people bring the values and some people bring the expertise. Everyone brings their whole self, and there has to be a genuine embodiment and integration of the ideals and the vision of what you're trying to do.
Yeah. And that whole self thing is a critical part, like whether it's a skill set thing or if it's a values perspective or an experience based thing. It's the contribution of the whole self that I think unlocks the potential of the space.
Look, I do want to ask you a little bit about your journey too. What led you to your current role as Managing Director of Brightlight, and what was it that led you from your previous roles in the finance sector to where you are now?
Yeah, so when you think about a convergent space, I probably fit into the characteristic of the institutional investment manager.
Right.
So I like to think that I was equipped for the work that I do. I guess in some ways that was a powerful period of training, but also narrow in many ways. I spent a good 17 years at Goldman, so working in the asset management side of Goldman Sachs.
Right.
And it was just it was a really rich experience, but it was always, I now look back in hindsight, I guess, and I see it as a period of learning and preparation for some of the work that I do today. It was always juxtaposed back with travel.
Right.
To the Mekong, travel to meet with an aunt and an uncle who served in Cambodia. I think you might be familiar with these folks as well, Max.
I am familiar, and this is a good opportunity to just disclaimer this, that Sam and I are related by a common aunt and uncle. So we have cousins in common and an aunt and uncle in common.
Indeed. It's good to be transparent with your audience, Max.
I think that's right. I think
integrity.
Yeah.
The excitement for me in taking those trips was to see the way that mission and enterprise can coincide, right?
Yeah.
And my girlfriend initially, and now my wife and I, would travel to Cambodia and find work that could be done in innovative ways by grassroots organizations. Right. And we'd see this in Vietnam as well, and we'd explore it in Laos. But for us, our heartbeat was, how can this intersection of the work that I do and the work that my family does come to life? And that was a 10-year journey. We would just travel in and out, exploring different ways, and we'd see, we'd learn and fail in some ways. For me, what was really planted deeply was this idea that capital markets
needed to embody a concept of stewardship that was bigger than just profit.
Right.
Through that,
learning about the different models in which investments could be made,
and seeing that expressed in
the periphery of my work at Goldman, but wanting to make that much more central. And some part of that led me to exploring with folks who are now my partners at Brightlight to really bring that to bear in a business model, which we now know
as an impact advisory firm.
At a time of a fair bit of economic trepidation and cost of living crisis, people out there are uncertain, they're struggling. It's just refreshing and encouraging to know that the system isn't necessarily broken. It just perhaps need some redirecting and need some values and objectives that are more aligned with real people and real outcomes and real communities, and that's possible and that's actually happening. It's not idealistic, because that's exactly what you guys are doing.
Thank you for the opportunity to share. This has been a really encouraging conversation from my side. I think you've framed it really well. We think this is a wave that is somewhat undeniable. We think there are people of values, and specifically, I think within this, there's an opportunity to see people of faith really activated in this area, where they start to think about stewardship in a different way, start to think about the things that we care about deeply and how that might be expressed in conjunction, in collaboration, if you will, with others who are thinking about similar things. And so for us, we try to make a small contribution with some of the skill sets that we have, but we're excited to be able to share, because we think that the encouragement of many is critical to the furthering of this work, I suppose.
You've been listening to Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart, and Max Jagannathan.
Thank you, Sam, for an interesting conversation about something that seems increasingly important, but something that most of us probably don't know or think that much about.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please do share it with someone else who you think might like it. And do leave us a rating or review. It helps people discover Life and Faith, and we'd love more and more of those people to arrive in the Life and Faith community. Thanks, as always, to our producer, who has been a solid ethical investment for CPX that has paid off handsomely, Alan Douthwaite. Next week.
We study health very well, we study income very well, and these are important, but people care about more than that. They want to be happy, they want to have good relationships, they want to do what's right, they want to have meaning and purpose. Why aren't we studying these other aspects of human well-being with the same level of rigor that we study health and income?